good afternoon, and good evening to in-house counsel and in-house legal professionals from all across North America and the world. Welcome to In-House Connect. My name is Shai Mahani. I'm the CEO and co-founder of In-House Connect, and I'm thrilled to have you here with us today. Thank you for spending your breakfast time or your lunchtime with us, or possibly your dinner time. And special thanks to our wonderful sponsors, Tangibly and Gowling WLG, and our fantastic presenters today, John Parker, Bachir, Chakra, and Chris Buntel, who are going to teach us how to maintain trade secret protection in an open source environment. This is our 64th webinar of the year, and I'm wondering if you're here for the first time or if you've tuned into an IHC webinar before. Okay, let's get to today's program, Maintaining Trade Secret Protection in an Open Source Environment. We have a wonderful panel starting with John Parker. John is the co-head of Gowling WLG's Global Brand Protection Team. John is one of the most prominent trademark specialists operating in the Middle East today. John is a UK registered trademark and design attorney in Gowling's Dubai office, and he's been practicing in the Middle East since 2006, managing IP portfolios around the region and further afield for clients. He provides expert advice to clients on a wide range of matters, including brand creation, filing, and protection strategies, and their implementation, including the use of the Madrid Protocol. He has extensive experience in managing global portfolios for clients, as well as the strategic management of regional and international portfolios and the enforcement of these rights. His practice also covers the management of IP litigation matters in the UAE and elsewhere for clients. Next, we have Bachir Chakra. Bachir is a Gowling WLG partner based in Riyadh and has over 17 years of regional and international legal experience in IP, technology, corporate commercial matters, procurement, and media. He's proficient both in common law and civil law and has a strong track record of providing practical, clear, and legible legal advice to clients. Having previously worked at top law firms and in-house roles in Saudi Arabia, UAE, Singapore, and Canada, Bachir brings with him a deep understanding of the regional and international legal landscapes. He has worked with people in the Middle East, Far East, and North America, and they all greatly appreciate his leadership, project management, contract drafting, and negotiation skills. Last, but certainly not least, we're thrilled to have with us again Chris Buntel. Chris is an intellectual property attorney with over 20 years of experience, and he is the co-founder and CPIO of Tangibly. Chris is passionate about trade secret management and education, and this I think is his fourth or fifth webinar with us, which demonstrates his passion for this subject and for In-House Connect. Chris, it's wonderful to have you, Bachir, and John with us, and welcome to In-House Connect.
Awesome, thanks, Shai. And when we were scoping this webinar, I really loved our title because it feels absolutely impossible. And that was my first reaction to this topic is, how can you possibly have trade secrets coexisting with open source software? Totally impossible, I thought. But it turns out once we dug into it, the three of us were able to come up with some ideas and some strategies that we'll share with you today. So this one, I think, is extra special. It's great to be here. Go to the next screen. And it's ironic. So I'm the only one on this panel who's not at a law firm, but I have to give the legal disclaimer. So just the luck of the draw. But basically, what we're doing today is not legal advice. We're not creating an attorney-client relationship between any of you. And if you do need advice, call some good lawyers and you have some on the call. And basically, this field of law around trade secrets is evolving daily. And things change, and it's just an exciting field to be in. And I've used this slide on many of my other webinars, and I really love the graphic of an iceberg. And just like in real life, the amount of the iceberg that you can see is actually very, very small. And that analogy works perfectly well with intellectual property. So the part that most people see that is the most visible or most transparent are the registered forms of IP, things like patents, trademarks, and copyrights. Everyone knows them. Everyone knows the process, the value. It's all very clear and easy to see. But all the stuff underwater is actually what makes up most of the iceberg. So it's all that other good, valuable information things like software codes, manufacturing methods, competitive intelligence, pricing and margin data. All this super valuable information that is not protectable at all by patents or trademarks or copyrights needs protection. And that's really where trade secrets come in. They protect most of the iceberg that you can't see. And earlier in other webinars, we've talked about the three-part legal test for what makes up a trade secret. So we thought rather than go through that again, it's more interesting to talk about, what is a trade secret actually in terms of real life or, plain English. And first off, it's an asset. It's a very valuable asset, and sometimes it's the most valuable asset in the entire company. And if you lost that asset, you would suffer greatly. This would be a very, very painful loss, and it could erode or possibly destroy your commercial position in the market. Very bad things can happen if you lose your trade secrets. And at the same time, they're often hard to see. By their very nature, they're secret. So they're something that are a little bit harder to wrap your hands around than something like a patent where you can easily look them up. And it's important to remember that in some ways, they're better than patents. Trade secrets can last a very, very long time if you choose them wisely and have good procedures and policies to protect them. Patents might last up to at most 20 years, often around 15. Trade secrets can be 50 years, 100 years, even longer if you're both good and lucky. But again, they're kind of a special animal that's a lot different than other forms of IP. And that's partially what makes them so interesting and exciting for us to work on. And in terms of examples, there are a lot of real world, real life examples that we encounter every day. Coca-Cola's recipe, Coca-Cola's formula is probably the most famous. It's incredibly valuable. And Coca-Cola spends tons of resources keeping it a secret, but other people would love to get a hold of it. Also, Google we use in and out of our lives every single day, but algorithms from places like Google or TikTok or others are invisible to us as consumers, but convey tremendous value. A lot of people choose Google instead of other alternatives because of the quality and the ease of use, and that's backed up by tremendous trade secrets. Recipes, the KFC special spice blend, different sauces, different donuts. There are many, many different recipes and ways of making food that, again, we encounter on a daily basis and don't really think about them being trade secrets, but that's largely how they're protected for such a long time. And even looking at undisclosed inventions and innovations, there's a lot that go into sports teams and even going into like franchise relationships between brands and franchisees can all be protected by trade secrets. So you probably don't encounter as many as you do a trademark. You probably see, 300 trademarks a day in your average life, but you also encounter a lot of trade secrets without even realizing. And going into the first poll, so we're starting off, how many of your organizations have a system for identifying and recording trade secrets? This will be really interesting and start the session off right. John, what's your guess? What's going to be the top rank?
Hopefully a number, well, it's looking like no at the moment.
Unfortunately.
There've been some studies. I think there was one study I found a little earlier, so let's see how that compares, which was a Deloitte study from earlier this year. So it looks as though we're there or thereabouts. With the Deloitte study, what came out of that was 29% of companies do not capture their trade secrets and 14% doesn't have a process. So I'm just seeing how this compares. I guess Yeah, it's very different actually. So I think the poll here, there's far more companies that aren't capturing their trade secrets at the moment compared to the study from Deloitte. So it's 44% here compared to 29% in the Deloitte study earlier this year.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. It'll also be kind of cool to do the same poll like a year from now or 5 years from
Yes.
now and see, are these numbers going to rebalance as there's more attention being given to trade secrets? Pretty interesting stuff.
Yeah. And I think that's it. I think it was something we touched on earlier, Chris, that I think what most of us are finding is trade secrets does seem to be one of the fastest growing areas that we're being asked to consider by clients, or at least suggesting to clients at least that they need to consider more and more.
Yep, I think that's right.
Right. So thanks ever so much. Sorry if I just move the poll off my screen a moment. So my apologies for that. So how to identify the trade secrets and evaluate them. So Chris has just run through some of the examples. And I think what's clear to see from Coca-Cola, KFC, etc., is you almost need to identify what are your crown jewels, for want of a better phrase. So what's that real asset that gives you the competitive advantage over your competitors? And what is that thing that your competitors would, for want of a better phrase, love to get their hands on and be able to replicate and take it forward? So what's your secret sauce? I think that's something, particularly for those people who didn't think trade secrets apply to them, that may be something that you need to think about for your company. Do you have your version of the secret sauce that you need to start thinking about in order to protect your interests going forward? So the trade secret, it will need to have the commercial value, as Chris has touched on. I think we'll touch on some case law a little later and some learnings from cases. But effectively what these come forward with, it needs to have this commercial value, needs to give you a commercial advantage, but importantly, you'll need to show that you've made reasonable efforts to maintain the secrecy. And I think Chris touched on a couple of P's earlier: processes, policies, and I think that's what will flow through all this, that processes, policies, people, these are all key points in managing both your trade secrets and also, as we'll touch on later, open source. So think about, if you do have some trade secrets, how have you managed them to date? Is it already out there? If it is already out there, it may mean that it's no longer a trade secret, and so it's difficult for you to now claim that back because it's public knowledge. So think about those things within your organization that are not generally known to the public, either not generally known to the public outside your organization, but also within the organization. The whole of the trade secret is closely guarded, and not everybody perhaps has full access to it. Again, we'll touch on some cases around this shortly. But I think the other thing,
John,
sorry.
I was going to say, one of the things that I often ask people when they're thinking, is something a trade secret or not, is if their competitor were to find out this piece of information, would you be very upset? And chances are, if the answer is yes, it's a trade secret. So that's a really nice kind of plain English test. And it's not perfect, but about 99% of the time, it gives you the right answer.
Well, and I don't have the full specifics, but I think there was the Coca-Cola Pepsi matter a number of years ago, where an employee from one company took some confidential information, trade secrets from, I think it was Coca-Cola, to try and offer to Pepsi. And then, of course, Pepsi brought the FBI in and set up a sting in order to make sure that they were seen as also safeguarding Coca-Cola, because, of course, they wouldn't want Coca-Cola grabbing their trade secrets. So companies do work together in these cases as well. Sorry, Bachir.
John, I was just going to mention another thing that's worth asking as a business is, like, do you distinguish your trade secrets from your other confidential proprietary information, from the know-how, skill sets, acquired skill sets of your employees and so on? Because if you do, if you like treat certain information differently from treating other confidential information, then that's a strong indicator that you are dealing with a trade secret. And it goes back to the first slide that Chris covered. When it comes to a trade secret, it's somewhat similar to sort of the conditions that patent applicants would need to satisfy when they're trying to claim protection of their invention. So it's typically something that's not obvious, that's not common, that is quite unique, unheard of, that is therefore worth a certain value, and that makes your whatever end product or output stands out just because of that intrinsic value in the secret. And you more often than not, as a business, will want to not disclose that information, obviously. And that's why then you have the NDAs and non-circumvention agreements and strong confidentiality clauses in your third-party vendor contracts to control that information. Some source code, for instance, in the software industry can very much classify and count as trade secrets. You'll see the Google algorithm that Chris mentioned. But yeah, I mean, it is quite important for businesses to try and distinguish and segment their trade secrets from their confidential information and know-how. And you mentioned, John, the case we'll be covering next.
Following on from that, it's that middle bullet point, I guess, is the thing to keep in mind, that all trade secrets are confidential information generally, but not all confidential information is a trade secret. So there is that differentiation to keep in mind. And I guess it is quite a high hurdle or a high burden to go from a piece of confidential information to a trade secret in order to substantiate to the court, should you ever need to, that we consider this to be our trade secret. These are the steps we've taken to protect it and educate people as such. Therefore, we benefit from this protection.
Jerry Ellison is asking, as a practical matter, how do we actually do that? Go about doing that? I think you're going to cover it in the next slide. But it's basically you document it first and foremost. Like you label it. You actually label it as being a trade secret, not just confidential information, confidential and proprietary information. That's one way. The other way is to actually make it not accessible to the majority of people. So typically it would be inaccessible, but for a handful of senior executives, on a need-to-know basis. But just back to you, John.
Yeah, thank you. No, let's move on to the next screen. Let's deal with those now. So yes, this is a number of ways you can go around protecting the trade secrets. And the first thing, of course, is education. So both making sure that document what your trade secret is. I think this is something that really comes out from the courts. You need to show that you've documented what it is, and then you've controlled around that documentation. So making sure that access to it is limited and controlled, making sure that it clearly states this is a trade secret, confidential information with restricted access. So there are procedures that have to be followed, or you have to show that you followed in order to demonstrate to the court, we've taken these steps to maintain and protect this as our trade secret. So there are a number of areas here. And I guess what I would say is documentation's probably the Achilles heel. The fact that companies believe they've done everything they can to maintain a trade secret, but when they're actually asked to prove this in a dispute, that's where things normally fall apart. So one of my colleagues in China, she's a former judge, so she had a case she was actually sitting as the judge for, where it was admitted by the defendant that, yes, I took this information. The company itself was running the argument, this was our trade secret. And then when the judge asked them to prove the steps they'd taken to prove it was a trade secret, that's where it all fell apart. And so they actually lost the case. And so I think what I've put here is almost, or what I have in mind is watch out for the 4 Ps. I think beware the enemy within, because you don't want things leaking out from your team. And so educating and training your team is important. The processes, making sure that your company have the processes in place to identify, manage, and maintain these as a trade secret. And then tied into that would be the policies as the 3rd P. And then, of course, the dreaded paperwork, because I think that's what you have to do to prove the steps you've taken to maintain this, should you ever need to do so. So I think with people, it is take care with onboarding new staff. Make sure that they are aware of your policies, but also make sure that they are aware generally of what your trade secrets are, so that you are educating people from the outset that these are our trade secrets and these are under careful control. I think the other thing as well around onboarding new staff, and it's something that we've gone through recently, we've had a number of new joiners. And one of the first things I do is sit down with them and say, look, you have to be very careful that you don't come into our business and bring information from your former company that you you shouldn't be bringing with you, whether that's in your head or on drives or whatever else. So it's making sure that not only are you controlling your trade secrets, but you aren't exposing yourself to potential action from a competitor that you're bringing employees in from. And then, of course, not just onboarding, but offboarding can be very important. So making sure you're controlling people who are leaving your company. A company I worked at years ago, as soon as somebody had handed in their resignation, that's when the monitoring would really start to make sure that they weren't downloading documents, they weren't emailing themselves to a Gmail address, etc. Again, to try and help control not just trade secrets, but confidential information, precedents, etc. as well. So it is something that you do need to think about, make sure that you're controlling the people and what they're doing. I think NDAs, of course, they are very important, as we've already heard, but I think I would say be careful. Try not to use precedent NDAs each time. I think we probably do need to give more thought where you are dealing particularly with trade secrets. So context can be very important to help frame the information that you're looking to divulge to the third party, what they're allowed to do, the operational requirements, etc. So I think it's being very careful when you're using NDAs.
And I think that's a very important point,
sorry,
John, on NDAs, because the discussions going on in the chat channel, very valid point came up on NDAs. Like, you have to really be careful about the way you draft NDAs, and if you're including trade secrets as part of the confidential information which those NDAs seek to protect, because oftentimes they'll also contain clauses like the confidential agreement will be just valid for 2, 3, 5 years, and then they will have a set of conditions where confidential information does and may become publicly known, whereas that's not necessarily the case with trade secrets. Going back to what Chris mentioned, like, they can sometimes have no expiry date. They can go on being trade secrets for years on years end. So you'll have to consider that in terms of how you're dealing with the trade secrets. Another point is when it comes to the employees who are leaving, again, the way you treat trade secrets does not necessarily have to fall in line with the way you would treat your common confidential information. You would very much restrict access to those trade secrets. Some practical ways of doing that is not allowing employees who have access on a need-to-know basis to download those trade secrets or be able to take print screenshots of whatever the content is. Having strong, stringent encryption, decryption processes in place to control, again, the access. So it's really about how much you're isolating that asset from access to it. The other point that's worth mentioning, going back to NDAs, and that's something that came up with me when I was in-house. You have to also think about who are the parties to this NDA. Is it just one business to another, or are employees of the affiliate of one of the businesses also disclosing details to employees of the affiliate of the other business? So when you're defining the disclosing party and the receiving party, you need to carefully think about who they actually are and how extensive is that definition. So there's some things to think about here. Cybersecurity, sign-in, sign-out systems, multi-factoring IPs all help to restrict, limit access to trade secrets, and then also segment that access. So not everyone has to know all the parts of the trade secret. You can actually restrict access to some parts of the trade secret to a select few employees and deal with access differently for other select few employees, so that really only very few have the entire complete picture of what the whole trade secret is about. That's how it's really different from confidential information. Back to you, John, sorry.
No, and I guess in the software field as well, of course, many companies have external consultants or third-party consultants working in them in a software development role. So it is key as well, making sure that there is that careful control for the reasons you've just explained, Bachir. And I think in terms of what you're delivering, I guess, again, the example with Coca-Cola, as I understand it, of course, is they won't hand over the recipe, but they'll hand over a bag of their mixture of ingredients that's made up from their recipe that's then diluted, if that's the correct word, for bottling, etc. So is there a way of you following a similar process within your business? Is there a way of packaging up the trade secret in such a way that isn't disclosing the trade secret, but it's almost, well, here's 50% of the product you need, which my trade secret is hidden within. So please feel free to go ahead and do this now. So I think, again, it's just something to keep in mind. So having those policies in place and, of course, actively managing them through a system such as Tangibly as well. So I think you have a depository system where you can keep up to date, you have your trade secrets in place, and then you know, again, you're accessing, you have an access and controlling the access to that information through a platform such as Tangibly. Sorry, Chris, I'll leave the rest of that to you a little later. And I think the other thing to bear in mind, of course, is probably 50% plus of the attendees today are probably in companies that aren't just in the US. I think I've even seen some people from Ireland and other countries pop up. And the other thing to bear in mind is, I think generally I would say that trade secrets law is reasonably harmonized compared to other IP laws, at least. But there are nuances from country to country. So if you are a company that operates across borders, you know, seek local advice, try and find out, well, what is the issue? What is the position if we're either working with a third party across border and looking to protect our trade secrets, or within our business, we're having to share trade secrets across borders. What do we need to do to protect ourselves under local law? And I think the other benefit of that is a couple of years back, we did a scenario where we were almost chasing down a bad actor through different countries. The other option it can take is if you are in a situation where you have a bad actor who's sharing your information with competitors across borders, some of your other countries may actually give you a quicker, easier, and swifter option to take action to try and stop the disclosure of your trade secrets as well and try and control this. So I think, again, that's something just to bear in mind. Trade secrets, we move on now to open source. So does your organization use open source in developing new products or services?
I'm expecting this response. I mean, open source is a tool that is available out there for use, for leverage, for the reasons we're going to cover in the next slides. Of course, it depends on what open source is available for use. Most of the audience will know that open sources, we're talking about open content that's publicly available. And by free, we really mean that it's not subject to any license fees or royalty fees or payments, which you would typically have to pay if you're using closed source. So that in and of itself is an advantage because that allows you to leverage that existing content that's out there. And it's typically prevalent in the software industry where you will have open source codes that are available under open source software licenses. And rather than reinvent the wheel, you use this existing tool, this technology, and be able to use it free of any charges. And by charges, I mean the payment of prescribed fees. So in that sense, it is a cost-effective way to develop your product. So you would use this open source in research and development, in engineering, and providing a new product, a new output. And the cool thing about open sources is that it allows for the resourcing of multiple talents, pulling in those talents and resources into the development of the open source for later use and sharing and collaboration. And in that sense, it's also decentralized. So it's collaboration among the masses, so to speak, to develop a product that everyone then can use. Of course, the open source does come with license terms. We'll be covering that in the next slide, but it also is now prevalent, as most of you know, with online AI platforms. So you will see with the AI, with OpenAI, GPT-2, Stable Diffusion, TensorFlow, is when you're providing input to these AI platforms, the output is open. The input also becomes part of that open source, and that AI platform can use that input in any way it seems fit to provide other forms of output and to share that output with third parties, which classifies it as open source as well. So move to the next slide because we're going to cover.
So
the
Bachir, it's
license.
kind of, nothing is truly
Yeah.
free.
Nothing is truly free. I was going to mention that next on the last slide. So while it's supposed to be free, as in you don't actually pay a fee, there's always a catch, right? So the license for your use, for your distribution, for your modification of the open source to develop your own product comes with conditions, with restrictions. Some of these licenses are permissive, classified permissive, and the other licenses are restrictive. I'm sure quite a few of the audience knows about the restrictive licenses because we're talking about copyleft obligations there. With the permissive licenses, those licenses are really open and free. They will impose very little restrictions, and typically those restrictions will be the requirement to attribute, to include a copyright notice that refers back to the original developers of that open source in your end product output. Those licenses also allow you to modify the open source, combine that open source with your own IP, so your own trade secret in this instance. So if you're looking to use your trade secret, you can combine that open source with your trade secret to create a derivative work. So you typically look at your closed source code in the technology field, incorporate parts or all of that open source in your closed source code, come up with a modified, developed, better version of your end product, and then be able to market, distribute, and sell that product for license fees. And that's why the permissive OSS license is, in essence, it's compatible with your typical commercial proprietary licensing, because then you will maintain your secrecy. You'll be able to maintain your secrecy. You'll be able to maintain your own proprietary ownership of your source code and still charge license fees for licensing the modified output to your customers. The same cannot be said about restrictive licenses. So here we're talking about real copyleft obligations, where on the one hand, the license will allow you to modify and combine these open source, but on the other hand, it'll impose on you the obligation after modifying it and combining the open source with your own source code, the obligation to make both the open source and the derivative, the modification, open under the same license terms for everyone to use. So in essence, you are using you're losing your IP, right? And more so, very dangerously, for your trade secret, you're losing the secrecy. And that's why it's not at all compatible with your commercial proprietary licensing. So if you are intending to license that output onto your customers and charge a fee for that licensing and maintain the closed source of your code, and so maintaining the secrecy, then you're going to run into problems if one or more customers, or if one of those OSS restrictive licensing societies discovers that you have in fact modified the open source and combined and used it as part of your own source code, and they can actually take legal recourse against you for having done that and not having made your own modification open and free for use for all. And part of the case law in the last slide will cover one instance where this has happened. Of course, the other catches are, and this applies equally to permissive OSS licenses, is that they will disclaim all sorts of liabilities. So forget about warranties. You don't get it. You use it as is. Very few permissive licenses will typically grant you any sort of warranty. So you're using the open source at your own risk. So as you can see with some AI platforms, when you're using that output, you are running the risk of potential third-party copyright infringement claims or third-party claims in general, right? So you must be very careful when you're evaluating and deciding which open source you want to use and to what extent that open source has been tested and is reliable in terms of delivering the output that you are looking forward for. The open source in that sense may also contain vulnerabilities, security flaws, errors, omissions. So you have to take all of those into account when you're incorporating and modifying that open source and incorporating it with your own closed source trade secret IP asset. And the last one is what I already mentioned. If you are using your IP, if you're sharing your IP with an open source, again, it comes to my mind, an AI platform, you may be very well giving your rights away to that IP by simply inputting that IP into the open source, because quite often these terms and conditions for using these open sources will and especially when it comes to copyleft OSS licenses, will impose that condition on you. So you're giving away rights. So yes, these risks do exist, the pitfalls do exist, and yeah, open source does come with these conditions, and there is a catch. So it's not all great and dandy and colorful. Just next slide. So it goes back to copyleft, and we discussed this in the previous slide, just to distinguish between some copyleft licenses. Most of you will have heard of strong copyleft obligations versus weak copyleft obligations. And really, very briefly, I mean, the strength or weakness of a copyleft depends on the extent to which it really impacts the derivative work, so the output. And it also turns on the scope of use. So for instance, the Sybase Open Watcom public license will not even allow you as a business to use the open source that is subject to those license terms for your own internal purposes without disclosing the derivative work to the masses, to the public, so making it open. So even if you're just taking this open source that's subject to Sybase license terms, and you're just using it to develop something that you will only use internally, you still will have to make that open. The design science license in this instance not only applies to software, it applies to any sort of content. So it's not just restricted to technology, to software, but it can be anything. It can be art, it can be anything that's subject to copyright, really. So the design science license is quite general in its application and scope. You'll see that some companies don't allow employees to use open sources with strong copyleft obligations. And having been in-house myself, yeah, we had a very strong policy against the use of open sources that were subject to strong copyleft obligations because the risk was just too high and it outweighed the benefits for using them. And we always try to seek alternatives to the open source in question.
Well, and I guess not just for your company, Bachir, I guess if you're a company that's outsourcing to third-party developers, is trying to restrict what they do as well, so
Absolutely.
that you don't fall into the trap they've set for you, I guess.
Yes. So you'll see in the terms and conditions in your agreements with third-party developers, with vendors, you will, especially if they are developing software or IT tools for you, you may want to include a requirement. One is not to use open sources. You can then negotiate may make some exceptions for certain open sources and then come up with an exhaustive list. And two, not to use the whatever input that you provide to those software developers in AI learning, right? So you want to include that as a condition. That's a new clause that has come up quite often. So you will want to include that in the restricted use section, where if you as the customer are providing a third-party software developer with your own information, confidential information, trade secrets, you must have very robust provisions, which exactly tell that vendor what they can't do. I'm conscious there's some chats. So should we deal with the questions later? I think that's better, just mindful. So we'll save some time towards the end to deal with some of these questions. Can you move to the next slide, Chris? So these are some of the common open source software licenses, which again, I'm sure most of you are familiar with, and the categorization as to whether they're permissive or restrictive. This is not an exhaustive list by any means. Many other OSS licenses do exist out there, but we just wanted to give you a general overview of the most common ones. That's the next slide, Chris. So going back to the same point that I raised, it is a license. So when you're using an open source, you do have to comply with the conditions of what the license terms spell out for you. And so you have to consider what are the obligations that those license terms are imposing on you. They may include copyleft obligations that we just mentioned. Those copyleft obligations may be strong or weak. You will want to have an internal process and obviously a policy, a guideline for using open sources to determine who is documenting and recording those obligations. How are your teams complying with those obligations? And to also monitor, very important here, monitor the implementation and enforcement of your own open source use policies and procedures. Are you doing that? To what extent are your research and development teams, engineering teams abiding by your policies? Are you auditing them? How often do you check? Are they following a system of rules and procedures, steps necessary to vet the open source with the legal team before actually using it? And are they considering how important is the open source for their research and development efforts? Are they exploring what alternatives exist out there instead of the open source in question? And most importantly, if the research and development effort involves the use of some of your trade secrets, what is the risk of exposure, of disclosure of that trade secret given the use or incorporation of the open source? And then determining whether the risk of such exposure is worth the use. Sometimes it may be, because you may want to disclose some parts of your trade secret, depending on market context, depending on where the business is at, depending on how long this trade secret has been in the possession. So a lot of factors do come into this risk analysis and cost benefits assessment. And this leads us to really the balance that you need to strike as a business between your open sources, using open sources, and maintaining the confidentiality and protection of your trade secrets. So typically in the software, you're having a closed source code that may be very well a strong trade secret. So you want to know what is at stake here. And going back to what I just mentioned, what component of your secret are you implicating? And who you are disclosing it to? Why are you disclosing it? And what open source are you using? And how are you going to be using the open source? Are you just going to be using it internally within your own organization? So you're not going to be using it externally. You will not be commercially marketing, distributing the output. More importantly, what are the license terms of the open source, which we just covered? Again, going back to the point that I just mentioned, how important is the open source to developing your secrets? Quite often, it is very necessary to engage with all concerned stakeholders within your organization to run with them a risk assessment and cost benefit analysis. So it's very important not to work in isolation. It's always strongly advisable to loop in all the stakeholders. And your first port of call may be the legal team, because the legal team within your organization will have this sort of 360 overview of the entire business ecosystem environment, and will know who to reach out to, what stakeholders to loop in, and get their input on it. It may involve the finance team, it may involve the sales team, it may involve the engineering team, procurement, you name it. Another question that's really worth asking is, what are you going to do when you've really combined your open source with your trade secret? What is the end game here? What is the mode of use of that finished product output? These questions are by no means exhaustive. Of course, these just are questions that really are designed to help you think about process, of striking a balance of using the open source while maintaining your secret in such use in an open source environment. How do you go about that? What steps you need to take? What steps are absolutely necessary? Who do you need to talk to? Why are you going about using this open source? And ultimately, what is the net result? What is the net gain for your business? Does it give you that extra added advantage and leverage over other competitors? Next slide, Chris. So this leads us to the next poll. Yeah, have you thought about how open source and trade secrets intersect before today's session?
26% says yes and often, 39% occasionally, that's the most, 21% are rarely, and then 14% are never, except for when registering this for this webinar. Thank you for your honesty, much appreciated to the 14%.
It's quite interesting. I mean, did the audiences start thinking about this when they saw the invite to the webinar, or before they saw the invite? But
Well, the results are encouraging, though. It's actually more
results are
positive than
encouraging.
I expected. That's great.
Yes.
Okay, and I know
It's
we're
good to
running a
see.
little tight on time, and I want to leave room for all the good questions. So maybe we can keep moving forward.
Yep. Let's move forward. So just in closing for open sources, I mean, using open source software for internal only purposes, like I said, may limit risk to your trade secrets. So in that sense, it's not always viral. So the copyleft does not always apply, but take mind of certain copyleft licensing terms, which even require you to make it open even if your use is internal, as I just mentioned. You can use the open source to develop internal tools, but those tools remain internal, as I mentioned. And you can also consider having separate software that is not integrated with the open source, but you can send externally. So you just keep them separate, you segregate them, and you can use your software externally. And one way also is to look at some use cases where you're using a weak copyleft of open source software subject to the Mozilla public license, for instance, where your use is limited to leveraging the libraries for existing code, which are subject to those license terms, and allowing your own trade secret closed source to only link to such libraries, such that you're still sandboxing your trade secret separately from the library. Although the library will sit on top of your software, it will not necessarily be combined as one product. The linkage will exist. So you can look at these different options again to limit the risk of disclosing your trade secret in an open source environment. Of course, you can't always eliminate that risk because of the flaws, the potential flaws in the open source, the vulnerabilities, the security issues that may come along with it, which again requires a separate IT assessment and audit and security analysis of the open source itself when it comes to that.
It's really, the slide does a great job of just graphically doing what we've been suggesting over the last hour. First you have to do an audit. You only know what you have if you go through and talk to people and really do a good scrub and figure out what are all of your assets. And that's true across any form of IP, but especially on trade secret. You need a strategy. We've talked, and John spent a while talking about policies and procedures. You need to have a game plan to understand how you're going to manage these assets to preserve and grow the value as much as possible. But a strategy is not enough. You need to do implementation. So it's not only the policy, but the procedures. How on a daily basis are you going to execute your plan to get from where you are to where you want to go? And then finally, and this especially is a great tie back to Gowling, is trade secrets are very much a global asset. They're different than patents, which are country by country. And you need to have plans to enforce them globally. And working with international law firms like Gowling makes that a lot easier. And in terms of top tips, again, a lot of it boils down to education and training. If your employees understand that you have policies, that you have procedures, and how to use them properly, that will go a long way to reducing your risk. Not to zero, but at least you can get close. You need to implement your processes. So having a policy and procedure is great, but you have to follow them. You have to actually go and live that culture and do things properly. And then especially around open source software, talk to legal and really understand what you're doing and understand the risk and the benefit before you take action. And working with great internal and external partners can help you make intelligent choices. That's really important. And this slide, it kind of reflects what we've talked about in previous webinars. Tangibly always talks about 5 best practices around managing trade secrets, and those are the first 5 out of these 6. So you have to understand what your assets are, first off. You need to control access. Earlier, Bachir was talking about having need to know or limited access. That's really important. You need contracts providing some form of confidentiality. And there could be a lot of different types of contracts, but you need to connect the dots somehow back to one or more contracts. And then notification or ideally acknowledgement is really important as well. If you're going to share a trade secret with someone, either internally at your organization or externally with a partner or collaborator, don't make it a secret. Just say, I'm sharing this trade secret with you. You need to take very good care of it because it's super valuable. Don't make people guess, is this a trade secret or not? Be upfront about it. Again, training, I love training and I talk about it every single time. And then the 6th step is kind of the bonus, which is, you have to do this ongoing. Trade secret management is an ongoing process. And once you start, just doing a snapshot on your first day is not enough. That's a great start, but it's an ongoing process, just like managing a trademark portfolio or a patent portfolio. It's something that you do routinely, and it becomes part of your IP culture. And we have another poll, which Shayat, we can very quickly do, but do you have written policy or guidelines on open source and trade secrets? This will be interesting to compare, kind of like the last one.
And I think this will be one, Chris, in perhaps even a month's time. How will this compare to the responses today?
Yeah, it's probably changing a lot. It'd be great to have like every year you run the same polls and plot change over time. I think we're going to see tremendous change in the next couple of years. So it's pretty interesting. A lot of people have policies on at least one or both of these.
But not, but not both.
But also there's a big group at having neither
one.
which is a little scary.
That is,
perhaps we should have thrown in AI policy for this as well, because I think that's the other growing area that more and more are writing that.
Yeah, that goes hand in hand, actually. So you should typically want to see trade secrets, IT security policy, AI policy, and open source usage guidelines and policies in place within the organization. And all those policies need to speak to each other. So they need to be consistent and aligned together.
Yep. Okay, so we'll keep moving, but there's definitely room for improvement among all of us.
And with periodic reviews, obviously, for all the policies. Stay up to date.
Yes, sir.
So John, over to you for a case law, and then we'll do a quick summary and then open the floor for questions.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and I think these wrap up effectively what we've been discussing the last hour. So with the Lynch-File Systems case, effectively what the court came down and said was Lynch-File hadn't proven prior to bringing the action that it met the burden, met the steps that it needed to have taken to prove this was a trade secret. Therefore, because they were unable to show it was a trade secret prior to bringing the case, it couldn't have been a trade secret. Therefore, the claim was dismissed.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, they didn't even label it, right, John?
That's right. Yes.
Labeled or documented.
I think it's maybe one of those examples where we've probably all done it from time to time. Okay, let's try and do this now because it may help us in this case in a couple of weeks' time, but the court saw through it, unfortunately, and steps weren't taken early enough. I think the mallet is an interesting case as well, in that it's that balance between the trade secret and say normal working policies. And again, in this case, it was the company took the view that their way of working was their trade secret. But again, because they hadn't educated staff or even marketed as such, it was held to be, no, it isn't a trade secret. You hadn't taken enough steps to make it as such, and therefore, again, the case was dismissed. I think coming on to artifacts, we've had a recent case, actually, a matter in the UAE recently. So generally in the region, let's say IP awareness is increasing vastly, but there's still some pockets of low awareness. And very quickly, we were approached a year or so back, a client wanting patents. And when we dug into it, they didn't want to disclose the patent. And so we said, right, okay, trade secrets we need to look at. And then when we dug into that, we then found out, actually, this is all open source software that you've used to develop these systems you're trying to protect. And we ended up having then to do a study through, I think it was 35 different open source licenses that their external developers used. And it went from, we want a number of patents, please, to, yes, all you've done is perhaps created rights for the open source licensor. And again, it was just that, well, where this has come from, really, it was the misunderstanding and not controlling external developers that led to the place of all this time, money, and investment has been given over for nothing because of the failure to take into account open source being used. And again, I think it falls in closely with artifacts, the fact that they failed to distribute, or even I think it was even said that they removed the copyright notice, which said that the other party actually owned the copyright in this open source software that was being used. And again, similar with the CATSA case. So be very careful where open source is being used either within your business or on behalf of your business by developers, and try and restrict it, as we touched on earlier today. Perhaps if I stop there and we can take on some questions.
Right, and just briefly, thanks everyone for joining. Bachir, John, and I really enjoyed preparing for this. Actually, I learned a lot just getting ready for today's webinar. And like we said at the beginning, if you need legal advice and want to have a great law firm helping you out, John and Bachir and the rest of the team at Gowling are fantastic resources that you should definitely consider. And if you would like to have some help and software and a great platform for managing your trade secrets and getting interesting insights, please talk to me or other people at Tangibly. So Shai, we've saved a little bit of time for a quick Q&A at the end, but this has been a great talk.
Yes, thank you, Chris, Bachir, and John. There are a number of questions in the chat.
I've been answering some of the questions actually throughout this webinar. So let's see.
So
I think there's a couple around SaaS, Bachir, and with your background around that, whether that's something you want to touch on. I think there are 2 or 3. The latest one on screen is what's the risk exposure for around SaaS, but I think there was another a little earlier that I try and find.
So yeah, can you touch on SaaS, risk of exposure, software as a service? Specifically here, you'll also have trade secrets. So if I'm understanding the question correctly, are you asking whether you should incorporate open source within your SaaS? What is the question here exactly?
I guess, what is the risks if you implement open source in a SaaS product? Yeah.
The risk is the same, really. It's if you have open source components within your SaaS product, you need to evaluate what those open sources are. Try to ensure that most of them are subject to permissive licenses. So licenses which do not impose copyleft obligations, right? If you do come across open sources which are subject to restrictive licenses and which exist in your SaaS, then you have to examine your SaaS and see whether you've sandboxed, sort of separated your own closed source from the open source, such that you're only leveraging, linking to the libraries of that open source, or not, really. Because if you have combined very much your open source such that you built it within your own SaaS product, then you are running a risk of being subject to copyleft obligations.
I saw that you answered a question before. Yeah, I want to touch on these quick in case people didn't see the answer. So Sam asked, Creative Commons license is copyleft. And yes, Easy, yes. What is copyleft exactly? Just refresh for the
So
audience.
again, a copyleft is if you take an open source and you modify that open source and you combine this modification with your own closed source, then you're creating a derivative work. And that derivative work is then subject to the same license terms of that open source. So open for all, free of any license fees, accessible, no right to restrict use, no right to commercialize and charge fees
Right.
for it. And you have to disclose your modification.
Right.
So it's the combination of the open source and your closed source to come and create a derivative work. You have to disclose that code to the public, make it open for all to use.
Gotcha.
That's what the copyleft entails.
Yeah.
And
Listen-
however minor or slight that modification can be, the copyleft is the copyleft. It'll still
Yeah.
apply. Linking to libraries is different. So from my time in-house, linking is not the same. You're not combining. You
Well,
are
What
so
is
you
linking
have
libraries? mean?
libraries, and I'm not that much of a tech expert. You have a library with algorithms, with codes, right, that are open and free to use for all. They exist. Oftentimes the R&D teams will want to use those libraries rather than to have to recreate their own codes, their own algorithms. Now they're resorting to AI. They're asking the AI to actually develop the entire source code for them. Thing is, that source code is not proprietary. Again, now you can link. By link, you're just communicating with the library, but not combining the library with your own product. So you're communicating with the library to get the functions necessary to enable your product to deliver whatever service it is to your customers. You're not combining. There is no marriage between the two. It's just a link, a tie. So when you're linking, you could use a weak copyleft license that allows you to do that. You would still have to obviously provide the library, not restrict access to your use because you don't own that library, right? So part of your distribution, you would distribute that library alongside your product, but you would still maintain the secrecy of your source code of that product because you've actually sandboxed it. You've isolated it from the library. So you can still charge for the use of your own product separately from the library. You'd still have to include the copyright notice attributions to the developers of that library. Of course, those are the conditions of the license terms of the OSS in that respect. Some strong copyleft obligations will not even allow you to do that. Sometimes even linking will impose the copyleft obligation on your product. So you have to be careful. That's why teams need to always loop in the legal team in-house, because what we would typically would do is go over the terms and conditions, read them line by line, and then advise the team whether the open source could be used or not, and if not, what are the risks associated with that use.
Got it. We have a few more questions in the chat. We'll tackle them and then we'll wrap up. So Jerry asked, it seems like it would never make any sense to use open source in any software that you intend to use commercially. I think that's accurate.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can use open source, which again are subject to permissive licenses. So we gave examples of some of the permissive licenses, right? So Apache license is one. So when I was in-house, again, our business, Microsoft does it, Google does it. They will use open source that is subject to permissive licenses, which only require an attribution at most.
Gotcha.
Copyright notice included in the About page of your software, which works. So those are compatible with commercial licensing.
Okay. Another question, what if you use an open source that is not permissive, but you only keep it internally? You're not distributing the software anywhere.
Again, depends on how strong the copyleft is. I'll give that example again, where even if you're using it internally, you would still, according to the license terms, have to make that derivative work, the modification, public and open and free for all to use. Some open source licenses do require that. I'll give an example again of Sybase Open Watcom public license that very much requires that, even if it's internal. One of the audiences asked me, well, how will they find out? Well, it goes back to one of the slides we just talked about, where you have offboarding employees, and those employees leave your business, and a year or two down the line, oh, lo and behold, you get a claim from this copyright license society that tells you, hey, you're using this open source. Oh, yeah, but internally, but still, it's subject to these license terms. And who knows? I mean, some of your departed former ex-employees, disgruntled, may have disclosed that information, albeit counting as confidential information, but still, nevertheless, disclosed it years down the line.
All right.
How will you ever find out?
Okay, awesome. Chris, did you want to add anything?
No, I think that's a good place to end. It's been a great conversation, and we'll look forward to the next session.
Thank you so much, Chris, Bachir, and John. Folks, if you enjoyed the program, please let us know in the chat and in the feedback form. Before we sign off, I want to kick it back to John, Bachir, and Chris for final remarks. Anything you want to add before we wrap up? John, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think I would say the 4 Ps, so the people, process, policies, and I can't remember what the 4th one was now. Now my notes have disappeared, but yeah, I think it's making sure the paperwork is making sure that you are keeping these in mind whenever you're dealing with trade secrets. And I think echoing the point Chris said earlier, your trade secrets today may be very different to your trade secrets next week. So these are a living beast, and you need to keep on top of them.
Wonderful. Bachir.
Just to wrap up, I mean, thanks again for all the time that you gave us here during today's webinar. Thank you very much to Chris, to John for their valuable inputs, and as also for the feedback that we're getting from the audience about the content of this webinar and presentation, and the questions, the very relevant, spot-on questions that I'm still getting in the chat channel. And thank you, Shai, as well. Again,
Yeah,
for
my
everything,
pleasure.
for organizing
My
this
pleasure.
webinar.
Nancy wants you guys to come back, so we'll have to make that happen. Chris, final word.
Just final word, these are exciting times for trade secrets. Tons of questions, and we'll gradually figure them out as a legal community, but it's the most exciting part of IP today.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Chris, Bachir, John. Thank you, Tangibly and Gowling, for a wonderful program. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in and for the active participation. It was a hot bench today.